And the third goal is to ensure that the jobs of the future located in the burgeoning service, knowledge-intensive sectors are more secure and better paid, and enable, importantly, talented women and men with families to maximise their productive contribution by delivering high-quality caring services. So I want, in the remainder of my remarks, to address each of these goals in turn very briefly. Let me begin with economic growth. Now, it may seem somewhat impertinent for a British commentator to come to Sydney to tell the Australians about economic growth. As a result of the austerity policies of the coalition government in the United Kingdom, we of course have spent 3 years going backwards. There is some hint of recovery now coming through, but nonetheless, compared to the impressive Australian economic growth rates of recent years, the UK is in no position to lecture others. But we have to keep our eyes fixed on the future. Most growth in the next 10 to 20 years will come through service and innovation-orientated economic activity. Now, the fact that our economies structurally are shifting from industry to services is hardly a revelation to people in this room. In most of the OECD countries, services now account for more than 75% of employment, traditional industry for less than a fifth. And I do think that there is an important point here for progressives to redefine our notion of what a good economy is. For the left, the traditional emphasis has been on industry and manufacturing. And yes, manufacturing is still incredibly important, particularly in the burgeoning growth manufacturing sectors, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, defense, high-tech engineering. But growth is also coming from the transition to a low-carbon economy. Growth is coming from new sectors like life sciences, and increasingly from sectors like the cultural and creative economy, as well as in the provision of new services, not least services for an increasingly elderly population. And my message on growth would be, we should not decry this new economy, but we should embrace it. Advanced economies have a head start in the provision of high-value services, like health and education, where demand is rising as countries get richer, and where there is a global middle class which wants to consume these services, and we should make the best of it. But we've also learnt, in particular in the light of the economic crisis that broke with such ferocity 5 years ago, about the importance of a government-led economic strategy. Leaving it to the market is insufficient. The laissez-faire approach to economic development has been shown to be flawed. The state has an interest in shaping growth through sectoral policies that promote future activity, particularly in sectors where private capital is difficult to access. And I noted in preparation for this speech that 58 of the most commercially successful innovations in the last 30 years in the United States were secured and delivered through support from the federal government. So even in a country like the United States, which is perceived as having a relatively inactive government, there is actually huge proactive investment in future economic sectors and in industrial strategy. And we have to keep investing in knowledge where the US is also far ahead. The goal for our economic policy should be an entrepreneurial state which is capable in particular of supporting new, small and medium-sized enterprises where job growth comes from as a key engine of upward mobility and opportunity. So having considered how we secure economic growth, let me briefly turn to the question of how to redistribute market incomes and assets. In the post-war era, in the last 60 or so years, the centre-left has traditionally favoured two types of strategy. After 1945, many of our countries invested in the post-war insurance state along the lines of the Beveridge model, where the goal was to provide insurance against major social risks, and the model was very successful in delivering that. Then, as the 1960s and 1970s progressed, there was increasing emphasis on redistribution through taxes and benefits, increasingly delivered through targeting. But there is a debate emerging today in a number of countries about how to make a further shift from passive income maintenance to proactive social investment, which alters the distribution of human capital in favour of the most disadvantaged households. We have to intervene as early as possible to break the intergenerational cycle of disadvantage, and that requires these early investment policies to be pursued with vigour. The policy levers here are not just about education and schools, but they're about all the factors which have a bearing on children's outcomes and their prospects of success later in life. These include monetary factors, the ability of parents to, with money, give their children additional tuition, extra classes, music, enrichment, all of the things that make for wider success. But also the importance of parents having time to spend with their children, reading, the quality of the home environment. All of these factors have a huge bearing on children's outcomes. And so alongside the importance of early investment in redistributing human capital and in making it more likely that long-term inequalities can be addressed, there is an important distinction to make between incomes and assets. Now, I'm sure we'll come on to this in the panel discussion. I think there is a strong case for continuing with traditional forms of redistribution, but we also have to accept that market incomes are highly sensitive politically, and there are continuing tensions in all of our societies over income tax policies. I think that there is a case for focusing more on unearned wealth and assets, excess profits, property, inheritance, where revenues raised from the relatively wealthy can aid social mobility by boosting the human capital of the less advantaged. These are just a few of the ideas that I think we need to consider in relation to the redistribution of market incomes and assets. But my third area is the importance of good jobs. And the truth is, we as progressives know that growth and redistribution without good jobs are not enough. I've already noted the polarisation between good work and bad work. But it's also important to recognise that middle-class jobs are increasingly exposed to international competition. In sectors like banking, finance, information and communication technology-related occupations, there is ever-increasing and more intensive international competition, and this is increasing insecurity among the middle class. Across the OECD, 50% of new jobs are being created by startup companies, and 74% of those new jobs are in service sectors. The rate of growth in the digital sector is on average 7 times greater than for the economy as a whole. But in many of our countries, the area of biggest job growth will be in the so-called stagnant service sectors. Now, stagnant service sectors is a rather unpleasant term, but it refers to social and care services, personal services like hairdressing, consumer services like retail, all parts of the service sector economy which have been held back by lack of productivity growth and which have resulted in lower than average wage growth. ICT in these sectors affords the prospect of major productivity shifts, especially in the public services, but this requires upfront investment. One point to make here, just in passing, is that we as progressives have to rethink our whole approach to employment within the public sector. In the UK, but also to some extent in Australia, we have allowed a casualisation, an outsourcing of public services to occur, which has eroded the quality of public sector jobs. And in some respects, I think this has been a false economy. In the UK, we may have reduced the cost of delivering some public services, but the consequence has been lower wages because of private sector providers attempting to reduce costs. And of course, government then has to step in to subsidise these low wages through tax credits. So there is a real incentive, both in terms of economic efficiency and social justice, to seek to raise the quality of public sector work. And of course, we also have to keep investing in education and skills, given the importance of information and communication technologies. But I would also note here that while we need schools to, of course, ensure that kids get good exam results, there is also a challenge around making schools real engines of creativity, innovation and knowledge. And that will be the big 21st century challenge for our education systems. So I want to just bring this to a conclusion by considering whether these 3 areas of economic growth, redistribution of market incomes and assets, and a push for good jobs in our economy amounts to a big economic idea framed around the idea of pre-distribution. Now, pre-distribution is a very ugly word, and no politician would countenance having a pledge card which has on it how we're going to pre-distribute incomes and assets. It is hardly a compelling political slogan. What do we want? Pre-distribution. When do we want it? Now. But there is an important underlying idea here that we really have to give due consideration. Pre-distribution means trying to alter the underlying dynamics of markets to make initial outcomes fairer, having less reliance on after the event redistribution, a set of ideas popularized by Yale University's Jacob Hacker. Now, I do have a short set of slides to present on this point, but I think given time, I'm going to skip over that because I know we want to get to the panel discussion. I might show one or two of those slides in a subsequent debate, but let me just make a couple of very brief points. The first is that, of course, Australia is relatively unequal in comparison to other OECD countries. It's by no means the worst in terms of inequality, but it is relatively unequal. We also know that states which have an unequal initial distribution of market outcomes often struggle to achieve more equal distribution of disposable incomes through the redistribution of taxes and benefits. In other words, there is a complementarity here because states which engage in policies which pre-distribute outcomes are more likely to be successful in terms of redistribution. And I think the empirical data does bear this out. But the big point I want to make here is that a strategy of pre-distribution has to go much wider than labour markets and wages. It has to be about giving all citizens greater economic power and control in relation to the market. This is a radical interpretation of pre-distribution, which, as Martin O'Neill, who's here, who I'm delighted will be joining us on the panel, has written expansively about. It is a notion of pre-distribution which, in many ways, is consistent with the contribution of philosophers like John Rawls and economists like James Mead, which addresses the importance of the idea of a property-owning democracy, where all citizens have a stake in ownership and in capital. And that includes intervening in markets to hold down prices, as Ed Miliband is proposing in the UK in relation to the energy sector. None of this, as I say, is about abandoning a traditional agenda of redistribution, but seeking to strike a more effective balance between pre-distribution and redistribution of incomes and assets. A final point in relation to pre-distribution, which I want to briefly make, is about addressing the need for more high-quality caring services. One of the reasons why we see a compression of incomes and we see middle-class, middle-income and lower-income households struggling is also because of the way gender dynamics play out within our labour and employment markets. The truth is that in some households, women are still disincentivised from engaging in paid work, or often work significantly below their labour market potential. Now, Australia has a female employment rate in the low 60s, which is by no means the worst performer in the OECD. But there are Nordic countries which have female employment rates well above 70%. There is also in Australia a persistent gender pay gap, which of course further erodes household incomes. Now, this gender pay gap has of course to be addressed through measures which deal with direct discrimination in wage determination, but it also has to be addressed by radically improving the economy of caring services which are available to middle and lower income families. And I think we also know from the evidence that decent universal childcare services often pay for themselves, as of course is the case in the Nordic states, because they raise employment and therefore tax revenues. The UK-based Institute for Public Policy Research has calculated that for every £1 invested in childcare services, £7 can subsequently be generated in revenues to government. So the future should be about how we can develop this model of caring services to enable women and men to make their fullest productive contribution to the economy, while also addressing the need for high quality childcare and good family services. I should say that I support the remarks that were made this morning about the importance of addressing women's issues, but care policies are not women's issues, they're men and women's issues, and we should be thinking about how we can develop a shared parenting model that helps all our families. I'm going to wrap it up because you quite like that, so it's probably the best time to move. But I want to just say in conclusion that, as I said at the beginning, it is always tempting to focus on the tactical and on the day-to-day, but I think the best chance for the progressive left is to engage in the battle of ideas. And in a world where people say that the centre-left has no big ideas, I think that we confound that by the quality of the debates that we have within our parties. What we now have to do is to communicate those ideas effectively to the wider public. But there is a big centre-left idea. It is about the idea of reforming the balance of economic power in society. It is about breaking down unjustified concentrations of power. And it is fundamentally about giving people more control over their lives in relation to the market. And I believe this is consistent with a story about economic freedom, social justice, equal opportunity, which has always been at the core of the founding vision and values of our party, and it should remain so long into the future. Thank you so much.